Welcome, everyone. My name is Keith with the Boleskine House Foundation, and I'm your host today with Boleskine Talks. And we're very honored this evening to be hosting Andrew Wiseman for his talk on the history of Boleskine House. Andrew Wiseman is a cultural historian specializing in the Scottish Highlands from the late medieval to the modern period. He's developed a keen interest, and as he describes it, perhaps even an unhealthy one, in Boleskine House and its long-held association with the iconoclastic occultist Aleister Crowley. He is currently editing a number of works and has authored around 20 chapters and articles, as well as numerous blogs and mainstream publications. As author of the forthcoming title, Lord Boleskine, Aleister Crowley and the House of the Beast 666, a detailed and engaging account of Crowley's residence at his Highland home will be offered, as well as the controversial legacy which he left in his wake. Now, before I hand it off to Andrew, just a couple preliminaries. As you probably heard as soon as you started the call, this presentation is being recorded. I'm setting everybody on mute so that we can have a crisp and clean recording for this. And after the presentation, we'll be offering a Q&A session. The way I normally like to do it on these is if you just type in your questions in the chat, I'll go through them one by one and make sure we can get to everyone's question. I'm really excited to be seeing this presentation. I've been speaking with Andrew since we started the project of restoring Boleskine House nearly 6 years ago, and he is very well researched. He knows a lot about not just Crowley, but a lot of the history of Boleskine House. He's done some amazing research, and this is about an hour long presentation. So, hope everyone enjoys. A couple things as well, just to let you know before we hand things off once again. If you like this presentation of Boleskine Talks and you're interested in Boleskine House in general, please follow us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/boleskine.house.foundation. And we also have a brand new website up, boleskinehouse.org, which we've revamped and has a very good events calendar now that you can subscribe to, and a newsletter that you can subscribe if you have not yet done so. I recognize a lot of familiar names on here already. So thank you all for all of your support in the last years, and we hope that this is one of many entertaining presentations that we can offer the general public free of charge in the future. So, Andrew, I'm going to unmute you now. You'll probably get a notification for that, and you can fire away. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Keith, for your very kind words, and also for extending an invitation to give this presentation this evening or afternoon, wherever you are. And the talk will be, as the title says, the Centre of 1,000 Legends, A Brief History of Boleskine House. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that I've only got an hour's time frame to talk about this subject, but I hope that it will be at least informative as well as entertaining. And I've had to cut out quite a lot, getting out quite a lot of information, but I hope I've been able to distill it down to the bare necessities. And again, I hope you'll enjoy it. So as we can see from the screen there, we've got a picture of Aleister Crowley, and that's taken in 1905 when he was in New York, when he was touting for support for another attempt at K2. And below is a picture of Boleskine House taken from the prospectus for Boleskine House in circa 1912. Um, but a magical house is as hard to find as a magical book to publish. I scoured the country in vain. Not until the end of August 1899 did I find an estate which suited me. This was the manor of Boleskine and Abertarf. I picked out Boleskine for its loneliness. Besides, Boleskine was already the centre of 1,000 legends. So Aleister Crowley wrote about the only property that he was ever actually going to own in his Confessions, or as he facetiously referred to it as the Hag. And you can see, just in case you don't know the location of Boleskine House, it's from the map there, you can see it's on the southern shore of Loch Ness. And just below it is a picture of Boleskine House from 1955. So according to one early biographer, namely Charles Richard Camel, the finding of Boleskine House was largely serendipitous. Perhaps, though, it was his love of mountaineering which found him at some undisclosed height on the southern shores of Loch Ness during the autumn of 1899. There he may have paused, he must have paused to enjoy the Highland panorama that revealed a house overlooking the wide expanse of water below. The property was attractively situated, somewhat off the beaten track, with a small and rather picturesque 17th century graveyard sloping towards the shoreline. He knew immediately that it would suit his purposes well and set his mind to purchase it. Money being no object, he was still a very wealthy man at this time. He immediately approached the then owner, Mary Rose Hill Burton, and being initially rebuffed, Crowley responded by doubling his initial offer to £2,300, about twice the market value of the estate. She could but not accept. On the 17th of 1899, just a day shy of his magical birthday, a 24-year-old Crowley became the new proprietor of Boleskine House. Elsewhere in his magical diary, Crowley recollected in third person the reasons why he had such trouble as well as taking such a big financial hit to purchase the property. Between the grades of 4 and 7 and 5 and 6, that is, between the ranks of Philosophicus and Adeptus Minor, 7 months had to elapse. And during this time we find Perdurable busily travelling the British Isles, searching for a suitable house wherein to perform the operation of Abramelin the Mage, which ever since the previous autumn had engaged his attention. He was still bent on carrying out the operation of Abramelin, and journeyed to and fro all over the country, endeavouring to discover a suitable dwelling for the necessary retirement. Thus it came about in October of this year, namely 1899, we find him settled in a remote and desolate district, a tumbled chaos of lake and mountain, in an ancient manor house, making all the necessary arrangements for his great operation in ceremonial magic. So here is evidence that Crowley advanced for purchasing the property to perform a magic ceremony with the operation of the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage, only recently edited and hot off the press, translated by Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers and published in 1898. Now, time does not really permit me to go into the ritual in any great depth, or suffice it to say that I will touch upon it later in the presentation. For present purposes, I shall give a very brief history of the house itself, beginning from its completion in 1809 until Crowley's time almost a century later, and I will of course touch on the legacy which he left in his wake. Present-day Boleskine House was commissioned by Colonel Archibald Campbell Fraser, a member of the famous Highland aristocratic family, namely the Frasers of Lovat. He was the son of the infamous Simon Fraser, as you can see there, Lord Lovat, known as the Old Fox for his duplicitous nature, and who was beheaded at the Tower of London in 1747 for his prominent role in the failed Jacobite rising or rebellion of 1745. And it may be added that his decapitated head still rolls, it was said, at any rate, around the haunted Boleskine House. His son Archibald, or Archie Campbell Fraser, is described as rather an eccentric character. something of which can be seen from his epitaph, written by himself many years before he actually passed away in 1815. Possibly the epitaph had been written some 20 years before his actual demise. And we can see this from the next slide to your left is the epitaph, which I'll not read out, and that is the Wardlaw mausoleum at Kirkhill, where he was buried in the traditional burial ground of the Lovat Frasers, just a few miles northwest of Inverness. Now, the earliest reference we have to an uncompleted Boleskine House comes by way of a mention by Sir John Carr, an English barrister and writer, who observed that near the inn is an unfinished lodge of the Honourable Archibald Fraser, a son of the celebrated Lord Lovat mentioned earlier there, known in the annals of 1745. Judging by this reference, Boleskine House took around 2 to 3 years to complete. And more than a decade later, an anonymous yet observant traveller who, during the summer of 1819, was making his way along the Great Glen, nothing new presents on either side of the loch till an advance of about 12 miles from Invermorriston, when the opposite hills appear enlivened with a neat white house, the seat of Mr. Fraser of Lovat, situated nearer the summit, backed by bare rocks, but with much fine sloping fields in front, embellished by clumps of trees. In between these dates, Archibald Campbell Fraser died in 1815, as mentioned earlier, and having outlived all his sons, he bequeathed Boleskine House to his grandson and namesake, Archibald Thomas Fraser of Abertarf. And you can see a portrait of him there. His grandson, who was born on the wrong side of the sheets. In addition to the house, his grandson also gained the Crown and Barnhill lands in the nearby town of Inverness. Nevertheless, the will was disputed, which led to decades of litigation due to a claim by his near relative Thomas Alexander Fraser. Despite such litigation, during the 1830s, Boleskine House, along with other properties on his estate, was refurbished, presumably to command premium rates as a first-class sporting and hunting locality of the Central Highlands. Ownership of the property could only have been sullied by the tedious and contentious litigation, which did not conclude until 1872, when its last embers expired in the House of Lords. And just a brief timeline which shows the ownership of the property from its completion in 1809 up until Jimmy Page, who owned it for 20 years from 1971 to 1991. And of course, it's always useful to establish a chronology in dealing with any historical processes. And these are the owners rather than the tenants of the Boleskine House. And that, of course, runs up all the way up until the Boleskine House Foundation as it is today. Now, here is a timeline which brings us nicely back to Aleister Crowley. So as you can see in this slide, there are many highlights of Crowley's timeline, and I shall give a bit more detail here and there, and we'll touch upon more of these aspects later in the presentation. But for the present purposes, we can see that he, as mentioned earlier, he became the new proprietor and moved into Boleskine House in 1899. He assumes the title of Lord Boleskine and Abertarf, shortened to the more impressive Lord Boleskine. In 1900, there was an outbreak of a schism in the Golden Dawn. In July 1901, he has various mountaineering trips in Mexico along with Oscar Eckenstein over the coming months. In August of that year, he visits Alan Bennett in Ceylon and intensively practices yoga and attains the trance of Dhyana. In 1901-02, he has wanderings in India. He travels to Burma in the company of Edward Thornton in 1902. March-September of that year, the expedition of 2K2 was led by Oscar Eckenstein. 1903, he's back in Boleskine, initially with Oscar Eckenstein. August, he marries Rose Edith Kelly in Dingwall, a honeymoon on the west coast of the Highlands. After that, 1904, he travels to Paris, Naples, Cairo, Ceylon, and India. 1904 was a pivotal year. Uh, 8th to the 10th of April in Cairo, the Book of the Law is dedicated to Crowley by a discarnate entity known as Iwas. 1904, on the 28th of that month of July, birth of Lilith at Boleskine House. 1905, in April of that year, Guillermont, Dr. Jacques Guillermont visits Crowley at Boleskine House, undertaking of the Great Haggis Hunt, which I'll mention later. 1905, the June-September of that year, expedition to Kanchenjunga. 1906, travels throughout southern China. 1st of May of that year, death of daughter Lilith in Rangoon, Burma. 1907, we see the foundation of the AA by Crowley and George Cecil Jones. 1909, Victor Neuberg commences a 10-day magical retirement at Boleskine House. And another pivotal event, 20th of June, rediscovery of the lost manuscript of the Book of the Law at Boleskine House. November of that year, Rose granted divorce from Crowley. 1914, May, transfer of ownership of Boleskine House to the Order of the MMM. September, publication of the Manifesto of the MMM, that is the Mystica Maxima, or the British section of the Order of the Oriental Templars, including a dozen photographs of Boleskine House. In October of that year, 1914, Crowley visits Boleskine House for the last time, the very last time. In 1918 of that year, November, that is the sale of Boleskine House to a certain Dorothy Cecil Brooke. So I'll mention some of these, as I said, later on in the presentation. Meanwhile, with all the braggadocio of someone coming of age, Crowley boasted in his confessions that he was white hot on 3 points: climbing, poetry, and magic. These 3 pursuits were to be the main focus of his time or activities at Boleskine House and throughout his early extraordinary career. His formative years were more or less subsumed by these early and continuing passions. Mountaineering after the debacle of Kanchenjunga would fall to one side, but poetry and magic remained all-consuming. And in some respects, all 3 of these pursuits, in particular ceremonial magic, led Crowley to discover Boleskine House, for he had found the almost perfect place. Carefully selected after a year-long and apparently a prolonged tiresome search, Boleskine House became his spiritual laboratory, with a focus on a newly equipped north-facing oratory in which he assiduously, at least from the outset, planned to perform a 6-month ceremony known as the Sacred Magic of Abramelin and the Mage. Requiring a regime of strenuous and ever more demanding strictures coupled with an increasing fervour, it is little wonder that Crowley eventually gave up after 2 fitful starts. Although he interrupted that ritual, Crowley nevertheless gamely continued. And to put it simply, the ultimate aim of the Abramelin ritual was to commune with the holy guardian angel, or inner genius. He was attempting to search for the divine spark hidden within his own humanity, based upon a Hebrew text in translation of 1458, written by Abraham of Worms, a German Jew, for the use of his son Lamech. The manuscript presumably passed through various hands until, at some time around the beginning of the 18th century, someone translated the text into French. It was this French translation that Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers had unearthed in the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal, in which he in turn translated into English, thus provoking one commentator to remark that the work was but the shadow of a shade. It came to Crowley's attention on joining the Golden Dawn, and he subsequently became fascinated and probably appalled by the working. As stated, the 6-month ritual, as specified in the text, involves an intense period of purification and meditation, including abstinence from sexual congress and also alcohol, 2 of Crowley's favourite things at the time, followed by a series of evocations of spirits that are constrained and commanded for protective purposes, so as to identify with their holy guardian angel. The Abramelin operation is considered to be a complex and demanding set of instructions of daily fasting, meditation, and prayer, with which results, if carried out to the letter, result in a Jungian type of individuation. Or, in other words, the crux of the operation was to harness the powers of darkness to serve the light, with the ultimate aim of achieving communion with the holy guardian angel, or inner genius, as mentioned before, or Algades. The text also stipulates the temple in which the ritual should be performed and when daily invocations and prayer should be offered. Boleskine House, accordingly, seemed almost perfect for his purpose, with its good size, the more or less north-facing aspect of its frontage, and, most importantly, its relative isolation. Crowley later outlined some of the reasons behind his choice. I picked out Boleskine for its loneliness. Lord Lovat and Mrs. Fraser Tytler, my nearest neighbours, were 8 miles away, with Grant of Glenmoriston was on the other side of Loch Ness. Boleskine was already the centre of 1,000 legends. In other words, as a spiritual retreat, Boleskine ticked all the boxes, and Crowley summarised his plans for the operation thus: one must have a house where proper precautions against disturbance can be taken. This being arranged, there is really nothing to do but to aspire with increasing fervour and concentration for 6 months towards obtaining of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. However, Crowley's meticulous plans to carry out the ritual were put into disarray by schisms shimmering and then erupting within the ranks of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Having joined the Golden Dawn on the 18th of November 1898, thenceforth his magical birthday, Crowley took on the magical motto of Perdurabo, I will endure unto the end, and rose through the ranks with consummate ease. The nub of the matter was that the Golden Dawn's leaders' increasingly autocratic and eccentric behaviour was causing ructions within the so-called London Adepti. Essentially, Crowley took the side of Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, the translator of the sacred magic of Abramelin and the Mage, as mentioned earlier, against the opposing faction led by William Butler Yeats, whom Crowley derided rather amusingly as a lank, dishevelled demonologist who might have taken more pains with his personal appearance without incurring the reproach of dandyism, and Florence Farr. Though Crowley had not precipitated in the upheaval, he was very much drawn towards its centre like a moth to a flame. His own headstrong behaviour had caused some disquiet amongst some of the senior London adepts, and consequently his application for initiation into the Second Order was firmly rejected. Disinclined to submit to their decision, Crowley travelled to Paris, where he persuaded Mathers to initiate him personally. However, this simply deepened the rift with the London membership, who refused to accept the legitimacy of his initiation. Further ructions followed, and in April 1900, acting on Mather's instructions, Crowley attempted to take control of the rooms and the magical equipment of the Second Order in London, later known as the Battle of Blythe Road. His attempt failed, thwarted by the intervention of William Butler Yeats and other fellow members, and the Lodge subsequently severed ties with Mathers and expelled Crowley. The order itself slowly fell into disarray and eventually imploded. Crowley's attention had been diverted from the operation when he states, DDCF Mathers accepts my services. Therefore I do rejoice that my sacrifice is accepted. Therefore I do again postpone the operation of Abramelin the Mage, having by God's grace formulated even in this a new link with the higher and gained a new weapon against the great princes of the evil of the world. Amen. This would seem to indicate that Crowley had thus postponed the operation for a second time, but details of the first postponement are unknown, although it may well be that he was simply referring to the delay in starting the operation in the first place. What is certain is that Crowley had now chosen, quite consciously, to ignore the oath that he had taken with regard to the operation and to interrupt proceedings so that he could attend to the wishes of his mentor, MacGregor Mathers. It may be noted here that Crowley and Mathers were going to have a spectacular falling out, which, perhaps inevitably, involved some rather peculiar occurrences at Boleskine House. Perhaps to get away from his magical travails, Crowley decided, seemingly on a mere whim, on the recommendation of Mathers' friends, to go to Mexico. He would stay for almost 9 months and was later joined by Oscar Eckenstein, his climbing master. There they would climb some of the highest peaks and break new records for rapid descents. It was also a prelude to their expedition to try and conquer K2, one of the most treacherous of the Himalayan peaks. Their effort, led by Eckenstein, failed due in the main to atrocious bad weather conditions and underestimating the sheer difficulty of the ascent. Neither Crowley nor Eggenstein would live to see the summit finally conquered in 1954. Crowley would not return to Boleskine House until April 1903, when, after taking his leave of Mexico, Crowley travelled extensively in the Far East, including Burma, India, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, Baltistan, and returned via Egypt, Paris, and London. Now, back home, Crowley fell into a period of self-reflection. The story is typical of my magical state of the time. He recollected, I was behaving like a master of magic, but had no interest in any further progress. I had returned to Europe with a sort of feeling on the back of my mind that I might as well resume the Abramelin operation, and yet the debacle of Mathers somehow put me off. Besides which, I was a pretty thoroughgoing Buddhist, but my spiritual state was in reality very enfeebled. I am beginning to suspect myself of a swelled head with all its cohort of ills. At this juncture, Crowley also made another attempt, as he had intended all along, at the Abramelin operation, but he was, once more, diverted by other matters, later writing that he abandoned all serious occult work of every sort October 3rd, 1901, and continued in this course of action until July 1903, when I tried vainly to force myself to become Buddhist, hermit, Highland laird. It was at this point during that summer that Crowley invited Gerald Kelly, his old Cambridge acquaintance, to stay at Boleskine House. After Kelly left to visit his mother and sister, then staying in Strathpeffer, Crowley was bored, extremely restive. The excitement and flurry of activity from the last 2 years clearly must have weighed on his mind, and so when an invite was extended to visit Kelly and his family at White's Hotel in Strathpeffer, he accepted it, and with alacrity, and so packed a bag and went over. There Crowley was reacquainted with Rose Kelly, Gerald's sister, whom he had first met in Paris. Their meeting was to change both their lives, as Rose explained to Lord Boleskine her romantic impasse, to which he offered an extraordinary solution. She should marry him, and so it was. On a mere whim, Crowley and Rose were married in the nearby town of Dingwall on the 4th of August, on the 12th of August 1903. Rose's parents and brother were indignant and so incensed that they demanded that the marriage to be immediately annulled. They had an opportunity to do so, but it was not taken. The young couple, despite the odds, had fallen in love. Crowley now had a new wife as well as a new life. Eventually, as feelings began to cool, Rose's family grudgingly accepted how things stood, and the couple made their home at Boleskine House. Apart from, I'll stop here to pause for a moment. This is a very interesting photograph of Crowley in Highland garb, likely a MacGregor tartan, and it's possibly taken, probably taken towards the rear of Boleskine House in 1905. Now, apart from undertaking magical operations, Crowley played upon the persona of being a Highland laird and took on the full title of Lord Boleskine. He enjoyed all what the great outdoors had to offer, and, as was his wont, took to the moors and lochs to go hunting, shooting, and fishing. It was his home, a spiritual base that he always returned to up until 1905, when, having his attention diverted elsewhere by other matters, his visits became ever more sporadic. But return he did to take stock and recharge. A married life had a profound effect. His 6-month-old nuptials were celebrated by Crowley as an uninterrupted sexual debauch up to the time of the writing of the Book of the Law. Life as a newly married man made such a deep impact upon him that his poetry petered out. So had my magic and my meditation. I let them go without a pang. I was supremely happy. Love filled the universe. There was no room for anything else. Indeed, everything seemed idyllic. With itchy feet, the couple decided to take their official honeymoon and travelled to the Far East via Paris, where Crowley took the opportunity to reconcile with Gerald Kelly. Their tour also took in Egypt. 1904 proved to be a pivotal one for Crowley, as it was in that year he received a message dictated to him by Ios, a discarnate entity, mediated and written down verbatim by Crowley. It was Liber Elvel Legis, or the Book of the Law, that would become the central or canonical text of Lima. Crowley, after issuing a circular about the book's reception, decided to practically ignore it, at least to begin with. He also wrote to Mather stating that he was now the de facto direct link to the secret chiefs or hidden masters, the spiritual beings believed to be responsible for the direction of humanity's evolutionary consciousness. This was not without consequence. And there is a very nice portrait of uh, Rose Kelly called the Black Rose. It was painted by her brother. Um, I think it's now in private ownership. Oops. Um, and there we have a few contemporary pictures, photographs taken by Dr. Jules Jacob Goulamont on a visit to Boleskine House in April 1905. In the left-hand corner, we have a picture of Crowley at his writing desk with Lilith. We have a group of gentlemen at a dinner event. I don't know any of the gentlemen there at all. There is a picture of Boleskine House in April of that year, and there we have at the bottom right a picture of Hugh Gillis along with Rose and holding Lilith, the babe in arms. So to return, by now in Ceylon or Sri Lanka on their honeymoon tour, Rose fell pregnant, and there we see the result of it in the bottom right-hand corner, and somewhat ill, and so they decided to return to Boleskine. A strange cocktail of carnality, conjuration, and creation may well describe Crowley's lifestyle for the time he spent in residence at Boleskine House. As Rose was housebound, Crowley entertained Rose alongside his coterie of cronies by continuing with the innocuously titled but provocatively obscene Snowdrops from a Curate's Garden. As a parody of life at the Turf Club, a one-time colonial sanctuary in Cairo, had apparently helped to inspire him to one of the most notorious pieces of transgressive literature. No taboo in this little masterpiece of pornography, as adjudged by Gerald York, escaped unviolated. Bestiality, coprophagia, necrophilia, pedestry, and urolagnia all feature prominently, thrown together at a mere whim to amuse and entertain his circle of close friends. His best-known outrageous decadent text would later come back to haunt him. A convivial audience consisting of Doctors Ivor Back, Percival Bott, and you can see some of them there in that slide there. Ludwig Cameron, Duncan Jewell, Gerald Kelly, and Rose assembled in the drawing room of an evening as each new instalment was read aloud, presumably much to their mirth and delight, including a bawdy parody of the famous soliloquy from Shakespeare's Hamlet. It was around this time, too, that Mathers decided to attack the Crowley household, as mentioned earlier, with a magical torrent of spells which had succeeded in killing most of the dogs. The servants, too, were constantly being made ill, one in one way and one in another. We therefore employed the appropriate talismans from the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin against him, evoking Beelzebub and his 49 servitors. And so apparently Crowley got on the job by counteracting Mather's attack with goetic forces. No harm, it seems, was done to the Crowleys, and Rose gave birth to Lilith on the 28th of July 1904. Later that year, to avoid the harsh winter conditions of the Central Highlands, the couple decided to overwinter in St. Moritz, Switzerland. And I should say, from this slide here, from left to right in the top, we've got Oscar Eckenstein, Gerald Kelly, Duncan Jewell, Charles Rocher, Rose Kelly, and Dr. Ivor Back, and a piece of tailored stationery that Crowley had printed up for use for his correspondence. And on this further slide here, we've got a very nice picture of Oscar Eckenstein and Rose Kelly enjoying rock climbing, probably taken near the Falls of Fires, just a stone's throw away from Boleskine House. And just another slide to show you the earliest photograph of that we know of, which comes via the Boleskine House Foundation, is the rear part of Boleskine House, and taken around 1876, whilst the second owner of Boleskine House was still around, namely Archibald T.F. Fraser. On the return from St. Moritz, Switzerland, as I mentioned there, rather ironically, the house's sinister reputation had become more formidable than ever before, Lord Boleskine's absence from his ancestral halls, I have little doubt that the Abramelin devils, whatever they are, used the place as convenient headquarters and put in some of their time terrifying the neighbours. No one could pass the house after dark. Folk got into the habit of going through Strath Eric, a detour of several miles. There were a great many definite legends, but I had made a rather point of refraining from making a collection. I was completely committed to rationalism, and the occurrence of miracles was a nuisance. I should have liked to deny the reality of the whole Abramelin business, but the phenomena were just as patent as the stones of the house. Conveniently, Crowley summarised other unusual activities that were blamed upon demonic forces that he had unleashed. They had curious effects on the neighbourhood. Even the tough, hard drinking workmen from Glasgow who were employed at fires would go a long way round to avoid that uncanny road. The forces had other and worse effects. An employee who had not touched alcohol for 20 years suddenly got drunk and tried to murder his wife and children. There was one of many similar cases. One summer more than half my pack of bloodhounds died. My servants were always getting ill. One of the men employed to lay down putting greens went insane and tried to murder my wife. I had realised by this time that my path to power was to be immensely difficult and fraught with danger, but I did not look back. Shortly thereafter, in 1905, April of that year, Jules Jacques Guillemot came to visit Crowley at Boleskine House with the intention of undertaking another climb in the Himalayas. Crowley could not resist the temptation of asking Guillemot whether he had ever heard of haggis or of a haggis. The good doctor said he had not, and was exceedingly intrigued by the ensuing description. Crowley then proceeded to give a farcical description of the ensuing haggis hunt. And there we have a picture of Guillemot and Crowley, as well as a mock-up of a haggis, or haggai, I suppose that's the plural of the word. The good doctor got quite excited about this fiction. I, on my side, got quietly to work. It was only 3 or 4 days later when my gillie, Hugh Gillis, we saw a picture of him earlier there, rushed into the gun room where we were playing billiards in a rather desultory fashion and cried, "There's a haggis on the hill, my lord." I dropped my cue like a shot and dashed to the gun case, gave the doctor my double .77 Express, while I contented myself with the Holland's 10-bore paradox. It was not 5 minutes before the stalk began in real earnest. It was pouring with rain as usual, but nevertheless I insisted on the party wading through the trout pond so as to lay the scent, whatever that might mean. But the doctor took it all in as part of the day's work. Crawling yard by yard on hands and knees up the little track that leads beside the waterfall to the duck pond, we made our wet and squelchy way with infinite care. The only risk of detection was due to my wife, who brought up the rear of the party, for she could hardly contain her emotions. Yeah, but you can't blame her. Well, ultimately, we reached the top, and with even more than redoubled precautions, we approached the spot where the good gillie had found the haggis. It was, needless to say, an unusually thick mist, but presently looming through the gusts, we saw the gigantic figure of the haggis. We lay dead still. Then Hugh Gillis cautiously beckoned the doctor to crawl forward, and I suppose he was not more than 20 yards away when he let loose and blew the major part to the pieces of Farmer McNabb's prize ram. Hugh Gillis dashed forward because it would never have done for the doctor to see the oats, which he left lying about so as to keep the haggis in the same position. He lifted the remains on his shoulders, and we dashed down triumphant to get some dry clothes. The next scenes lie in Newchattle. The doctor had the head mounted with a gold plate, suitably inscribed haggis, shot at Boleskine, and then the date. But this prank was merely a prelude to Crowley's and Guillemot's next big adventure when he attempted, unsuccessfully as it turned out, to scale Kanchenjunga, the world's third highest peak. Indeed, oops, if you have to forgive me, I slipped there. Kanchenjunga, the world's third highest peak. Indeed, his second Himalayan expedition ended in controversy and tragedy, possibly one which could have been avoided, along with permanent damage to Crowley's reputation as a mountaineer. from which he would never fully recover. He had not known it then, but this was his final farewell to the Himalayas. But thereafter, he still retained an interest in mountaineering and a hankering uh, or yearn to try his luck once more. It would remain, however, one of his unfulfilled ambitions. And again, Crowley would not live to see the peak finally conquered in 1955 by a British team using the same route as Crowley and his mountaineering companions had pioneered some 50 years prior. However, towards the end of that year, 1905, Crowley found himself severely vexed by a philosophical quandary. Everything achieved thus far, or so it seemed, counted for absolutely nothing. He concluded that he had to return to some unfinished business and to return to the great work and obtain knowledge and conversation with his holy guardian angel. To that end, during the winter of 1905-06, Crowley, along with his wife and infant child, travelled from India to China, where he pondered over the direction that he should take. By eschewing physical appurtenances, Crowley distilled the magical operation into a mental exercise. My plan was to transport the astral form of my temple at Boleskine to where I was, so as to perform the invocation of it. It was not necessary for me to stay in one place during the ceremony. I frequently carried it out while riding or walking. I had no difficulty in visualizing the astral temple by an effort of will, and of course I was perfectly able to watch the results of the invocations with my astral eyes. During these weeks, I developed the technique, though not to the full extent described in Liber Shemek. Eventually, Crowley claimed to have succeeded, but it was far away from his so-called ancestral halls. Many months later, after separating from his wife and child to take a separate route backwards, or rather back via the Far East and North America, Crowley arrived back to some devastating news. Lilith, his firstborn, was dead. This event did not help their faltering relationship, and although his magical attainments and spiritual heights were rising to ever further heights, Crowley's personal life was lying in ruins as his marriage was falling apart. To make matters worse, a pregnant Rose took to drink as her favoured coping mechanism was to drown her sorrows with hard liquor. Despite an unconventional if promising start, their union was doomed to fail from the outset, as both parties became nothing less than embarrassing to one another, and ultimately their marriage became one of inconvenience. As one can imagine, it was an unhappy time for the both of them, and apparently, on Crowley's insistence, Rose would eventually file for a divorce on grounds of infidelity. That would happen in 1909. Meanwhile, Crowley's humour, at times quixotic, brutal, and oftentimes bizarre, seems to have survived the breakup of his marriage. I was very glad to be back at Boleskine, he later recalled. I had no particular plans. I had really settled down. If I had a tendency at all, it was to play little practical jokes. They were the outcome of my happiness. I put up a signboard in the field across the way. This way to the Kulumuluvik does not bite, in the hope that the wayfarer might amuse me by going to look for it. As a matter of fact, this animal created the greatest horror in the neighbourhood, the more so that it remained invisible. Once the sign was erected, Crowley and his gillie sat on the great terrace to observe the reactions of passers-by in reading the notice. Although Crowley claimed, I assure you, that it was very amusing, he also admitted that others did not see the funny side, as people were afraid to pass along the road even by day, as, owing to the legends about the house, they have been previously afraid to do so by night. Returning as he did in May 1905, and so as we do now to the ritual, the contention is that Crowley failed to follow through on his commitment, invoked by his oath, and thereafter his rather lackadaisical attitude to the ritual, and in particular to banishing practices which had, as he seems to admit, unintentional consequences. Whether breaching magical etiquette or not, this is the period when legends about Boleskine House began to grow more legs and arms, some of which were, of course, of his own making. In an article that he wrote for the Sunday Dispatch in the 1930s, Crowley provided a truncated account of his aims in undertaking the operation and a simplified, and one could say sanitized, account of the appearance of the demons. It was at the direction of the head of the order, that is Mathers, that I then went to Scotland, to my manor house of Boleskine, which is 2 or 3 miles from the Falls of Foyers. My subsidiary object, the principal aim, is too sacred to discuss. Put into simple language, was to gain control over the 4 great princesses of the evil of the world. According to the rules of magic, I built a terrace with a northern aspect and carted river sand to it. I worked in the breakfast room at making the talismans which were necessary to my purpose. The sun was streaming into the room, but in vain. There was a darkness which could be felt. The demons, evil forces, had congregated round me so thickly that they were shutting off the light. It was a comforting situation. There could be no more doubt of the efficiency of the operation. But I went on with my work, even though I had to light a lamp, with the sun shining brightly outside. The demons collected also in the lodge which I had built on the terrace. They were still vague shapes, half-seen faces. I got used to them. The intervening years before eventually returning to his Highland estate proved to be a mixed bag for Lord Boleskine, with 1906 plunging him into a nadir and written off as an annus horribilis, followed by those which Crowley described rather ambivalently as years of fulfilment and elsewhere as full of ostensibly incoherent events. But return he did, and this time brought with him, or rather extended, an invitation to Victor Neuburg and Kenneth Martin Ward. Crowley had first met them at his alma mater back in Trinity in Cambridge. Neuburg became the first member to enroll in the AA, co-founded by Crowley and George Cecil Jones, as mentioned earlier, some 2 years earlier, and launched in early 1909 when JFC Fuller joined to form the requisite tripartite. Neuburg signed his probationer's oath on the 5th of April 1909, and only a few months later undertook a rather grueling 10-day magical retirement. And passing his apprenticeship, the upshot was that Neuburg's magical record represents one of the first or earliest forms of Crowley's teaching methods with an aspirant. The empirical nature of jotting down mental states on an almost hour-by-hour basis, depending upon the various techniques being practiced at any given time, was a methodology insisted upon by scientific Illuminism, by fashioning magic with Crowley's famous dictum to combine the aim of religion with the method of science. In other words, to pursue by experiment in a systematic fashion the scientific basis for spiritual reality or truth. A day after Neuburg's completion of his retirement, the fates were once again at play, for on the 28th of June 1909, another immense event of serendipity took place. Whilst Crowley was rummaging either in the lumber room for a tennis racket or in the attic for some paintings and a pair of skis that he had promised to lend Ward, there are 2 different testimonies about this, he discovered the lost manuscript of the Book of the Law. The latter work, which is of course pivotal to Crowley's thelemic message and contains the famous Rabelasian mantra, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. The find, as revealed by Crowley, came like a thunderbolt, and elsewhere in a diary entry, the stupendous event was described in ecstatic terms, reflecting either excitement or relief on finding his long-lost manuscript. Glory be to not had it in the highest. A little before midday, I was impelled mysteriously, though exhausted by playing fives, billiards, etc., till 6 this morning, to make a final search for the elemental tablets. And lo, when I had at last abandoned the search, I cast mine eyes upon a hole in the loft where there were ski, etc., and there, oh, holy, 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 were not only that I sought, but the manuscript of Liber Legis. The rediscovery of the Book of the Law was hugely significant, for it was yet another, possibly the key turning point in Crowley's magical life. To simplify matters, the rest of his life may be described as a reaction to the manuscript's rediscovery. Such was the impact of the find, fateful or otherwise, that Crowley fell into a daze for a whole 2 days, claiming to have performed a sort of supplementary samasati, Only when he betook himself to the undulating moors rising above Boleskine House did he finally arrive at the dogged realization of what he was to do with the remainder of his life. Meanwhile, Crowley's Neuburg's and Crowley's fractious relationship would last for another 5 years, but not so for Crowley's marriage, as mentioned before. Arguments over the custody of Lolo Zaza, who entered the world on the 2nd of December 1905, became a bone of contention in their divorce case, which became something of a cause célèbre and was syndicated in the local and national press. Its sheer bizarre nature made for good copy. Derived from Gerald Kelly's testimony, that is Crowley's brother-in-law, which ended their by now fractious relationship. The following report describes well Crowley's magical activities along with his rampant Celtophilia. The defender was very proud of having Scottish blood in his veins, which isn't true, he didn't have any, as he thought, and in 1900 or 1901, rather 1899, bought Boleskine to be his permanent home. He had no home and he bought the place to live in. He had a curious idea or ideas of how to fit up a house. He put mirrors round the room and called it a temple. He had invented a new sort of religion. He was a Kabbalist and studied ancient manuscripts. He took Boleskine in order to suit his own tastes. Abroad and in London, he lived in hotels, and Boleskine was the only home he had. When he got Boleskine, he took the name of MacGregor to identify himself with Scotland. While he was travelling abroad, the defender sometimes signed himself Crowley and sometimes MacGregor. He changed his name from Alexander to Aleister because it was Scottish, but he retained the name of Aleister Crowley for literary work. The defender got some mark of distinction from some Indian chief and thereupon called himself Lord Boleskine. But in any case, the divorce proceedings, however acrimonious, concluded in Rose's favour as she was granted a decree of divorce, with the custody of the child to the pursuer, with aliment of the rate of £1 weekly. Crowley now became a free man again. Although Crowley's inured nomadic streak did not lend itself to comfortable domesticity or marital stability, he was emotionally, if not romantically, attached to his Highland residence. Thus it came as a very much a wrench as well as an inconvenient financial loss when he finally had to let it go. He had hoped to set up Boleskine House as a profess house or Kaaba, and even issued a glossy brochure featuring a dozen illustrations of Boleskine House and its surroundings, just around the estate. The manifesto of the MMM, published in 1914, aimed to lure new members in a bid to shore up Crowley's finances. He had by this time squandered most of his vast fortune. The plan was not a success, and due to a lack of finances, on the 5th of May 1914, Crowley legally had to relinquish sole ownership of Boleskine House. At the outbreak of hostilities that signalled the start of the First World War, Crowley busied himself by climbing in Switzerland with the intention of making a final attempt at conquering Kanchenjunga. This venture, however, came to nothing. Struck down by a severe bout of phlebitis in his left leg, Crowley was incapacitated for the next few months. To recuperate and to rest up for a while, Crowley returned north for the very last time. As middle age yawned, Crowley found himself at a very low ebb, both in mundane and spiritual terms. In his final days at Boleskine House, Crowley worried about the future, not only his own, but that of mankind in general. A day before his departure, Crowley signed a new lease for Boleskine House and, on the 24th of October 1914, embarked for New York with £50 left in his pocket, a wallet stuffed to the brim with Masonic charters, and a trunk crammed full of his rare, as yet unsold limited editions, mainly custom bound by Zaehnsdorf. There, another vista opened for Crowley. Though he'd never returned to Boleskine, Crowley would later look back in fondness at his time spent there. For instance, during the early 1930s, when sightings of Nessie began to appear in the local and national press, Crowley, who was apparently taken by the subject, wrote a few articles such as "The Monster of Loch Ness," presumably had his tongue in his cheek, in which he observed, "These alone had sufficed to give Boleskine an evil reputation, and my own experiences there by no means diminished that evil reputation. So you will appreciate my interest in the latest story about Loch Ness, about which there have been so many speculations." He also mentions the Abramelin ritual and its so-called malefic results. And another article which covers similar ground entitled The Magician of Loch Ness: Uncanny Happenings at Manor of Boleskine House, where he covers similar grounds. Clearly, Crowley could hardly forget about his time spent at Boleskine House, for it remained a very special place for him. And also for those who remembered Lord Boleskine, older residents reminisced about Crowley in a radio programme entitled Beast of Boleskine, after a nickname that the locals apparently gave him. Um, and there's one, not a local resident, but a very famous picture of Jimmy Page at the rear of Boleskine House, taken by Douglas Corrance. Um, and one of the locals who did apparently remember Crowley was Ellen Williamson, then aged 88, who paints a rather childlike, if sinister, witch figure cutting through the sleepy town of Foyes. And he believed not to be listening to my drone any further until I resume, and you can listen to her recollection of Aleister Crowley.
When I saw Crowley first, I was 7 years old. I used to, whoever I was walking alongside, say my sisters or my father and mother, I used to creep to the other side to get at the back of them so that I wouldn't be seen them. It was this figure of him, you know, how he was dressed up. Very frightening. A great big long black cloak. We called it a cloak. It covered him all up, right down to his ankles. And then he had this great big broad hat. And it came to a peak at the top. And that itself looked a bit weird, because there was nobody about that wore the same clothes. We creeped in to the side of the road when we saw him coming at a distance. So we said to one another, "There's Crowley." So when we came up to him, he said, "No," he said, "don't be frightened of me. I won't harm you."
Summarise, she paints a very sinister, almost comical figure of recollection of Crowley, which seems to have been influenced by what she might have read and experienced. Anyway, it's interesting to know that when this was recorded in the 1980s, and this is going back when she was must have been about, go back about 70 odd years, and she still remembers this rather remarkable figure when she was staying in Foyers and visiting Boleskine House. Anyway, so by way of conclusion, we may ask why, and should I'd like to draw together some of the reasons in conclusion. The house was his home. Boleskine House was his home, the only property he would ever actually own. But it also witnessed many important events during his formative years, including his first marriage, the birth of his first child, and the place he used as a base from which he would leave periodically to explore the wider world, and also to make attempts to conquer two of the world's highest mountains. Further, it was the spiritual base where he undertook his first serious occult or mystical ceremonial work with the Abramelin ritual. Boleskine House was also the place where he took formal steps in his teaching methods for his newly established magical order. It was the very place, too, that he rediscovered the Book of the Law, a text central to Thelema. The house was also slated to become a profess house, just as he was to do in Cefalù in northern Sicily in the 1920s. And last but not least, as Lord Boleskine, his love of aliases was legion. Crowley also had the opportunity to play out his full Scottish Celtophilia and romance to the fore as a Highland laird. These are but some of the reasons why Lord Boleskine and Boleskine House remain close to Crowley's heart, and of course his connection to the place is unlikely to ever be forgotten, such is its mysterious allure. For as everyone knows, who has an interest in the place, knows that Jimmy Page, that which we saw earlier there, of Led Zeppelin fame, purchased Boleskine House in 1971, owned it for 20 years, and just like its infamous previous owner, only stayed there on a sporadic basis. Of course, such a purchase may be regarded as having gained the crown jewel in an apparently expanding collection of Crowleyana. It may well be that he regretted selling the property on. After relinquishing ownership, Page, in conversation with Timmy Darch-Smith, is said to have considered repurchasing Boleskine House in order to pay homage to Crowley by setting it up as a museum to celebrate his life, as well as to house Page's vast collection of memorabilia, including many rare and expensively bound first editions, along with other miscellaneous precious pieces of paraphernalia connected with the study of magic and the occult. Grady L. McMurtry, perhaps better known as Himenius Alpha, and the then head of the OTO from 1969, wrote to Page on 21st of February 1975, asking what his plans were for the restoration of Boleskine House. 2 years later, on the 19th of July 1977, McMurtry again wrote to Page, I am told you have purchased Boleskine House with the thought of renovating it and making it a profess house of Aleister Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis. On both occasions, McMurtry suggested meeting up to discuss face-to-face with Page to find out what he may have had in mind. Whether or not McMurtry received any positive reply or on either occasion, or whether he had a meeting with Page remains unclear. Either way, Page's ambitious plans never made it beyond the drawing board and remained unrealised when Boleskine House was eventually sold on in 1991. And it went on to be owned by the McGilvarys. Boleskine House, since then, has seen a series of owners, and Phoenix-like, the house is currently being restored and refurbished from the ashes of two devastating fires. One accidental in 2015, followed by a possible arson attack in 2019, which is due to be completed at the end of this year or perhaps at the beginning of next year, but I'm sure Keith will be able to fill us in with more details there. And so the house, once owned by Aleister Crowley in the guise of Lord Boleskine, will again be restored to its former glory. And thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you found some interesting information there and hopefully found it entertaining enough. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, that is Andrew Wiseman, who is currently working on a very extensive history of Boleskine House. We have been very honored to be able to host him tonight. And I can't tell you how much I thank you for your contribution and research over the past years since we've started this project. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Well, thank you for the kind invitation and for giving me the opportunity to at least give some background as well as the opportunity to say something about the research I've been undertaking, and hopefully people would have enjoyed hearing some of the history of the house, which is, as we know, has a rather fascinating history all of its own. There's not many properties in the Highlands like it. Well, it's unique. Let's put it that way.
We will certainly share details for your upcoming work when it's ready, and hope to be able to have it in our library as a feature. So
That's very kind of you.
But anyway, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. It's been a very good turnout. Keep an eye on us on social media, boleskine.house.foundation at Facebook, also on Instagram, and you can follow our events calendar on our website as well.